In the spring of 1891, in the small Württemberg town of Calw, a boy of 13 let himself out of his father's house in the early part of the evening and walked down through the narrow streets toward the water. The house behind him was a pious house. It smelled of ink and of paper, and of the particular dryness of rooms where prayer is a daily labor, rather than an occasional comfort. And the voices in it belonged to people who had crossed oceans for the sake of a doctrine, and had come home again, convinced that the doctrine had been worth the crossing. The boy was not, that evening, thinking about doctrine. He was thinking about the river. The Nagold ran through Calw, as it had run through it for longer than anyone in the town could account for, sliding past the timbered houses and under the covered bridge, gathering itself at the weirs below the tannery, where the water turned white and loud for a moment, and then, a little further on, went quiet again and resumed its travelling. He stood at the edge of it with his hands in his pockets and watched it go by. And he did what children do at rivers, which is nothing at all, for a long time. Nobody recorded that particular evening. What is recorded is that the boy stood at that water often, that he remembered it for the rest of his life, and that 70 years later, when he had become one of the most widely read writers in the German language, and had received the Nobel Prize, and had outlived 2 wars and most of his friends, he was still writing about rivers. The name he would eventually be known for is Hermann Hesse. He was born in Calw on the 2nd of July in 1877, into a family of missionaries and Indologists and publishers of religious tracts, and he spent the whole of a long and frequently painful life arguing in book after book with the single conviction that household had tried to give him. The irony in it is almost too neat to be true, and yet it is true. He was raised among people who believed that the truth arrives from outside a person and must be accepted, that it comes down through scripture and sermon and the authority of those who have been sent, and that the proper response of the soul is surrender to a message already complete. And he became a writer whose entire body of work insists on the opposite, that whatever is worth calling truth arrives only through listening, that it cannot be handed over, that it must be heard by each person for himself in the particular circumstances of his own life, and that the moment it is formulated into a teaching and passed along, it begins, quietly, to die. The child of the missionaries grew into the man who could not be converted and could not convert anyone. He would put that refusal into the mouth of a young Brahmin walking away from the Buddha himself, saying, with great respect and no obedience at all, that no teaching had ever been able to give him what he needed, and that he would have to find it in his own way. What lay between the boy at the weir and the old man in the Ticino hills was not a straight road. It was a series of collapses, each of which he survived by writing his way out of it. There was the seminary at Moulbron, the great Cistercian monastery, converted into a school for the promising sons of Protestant Württemberg, where he was sent at 14, and from which he fled after 7 months, spending a night in a field before he was found. There were the difficult years that followed, the failed apprenticeships, the sense of being a problem to be managed rather than a person to be heard. There was the bookshop in Tübingen, where he stood 12 hours a day among the stacks and read himself awake in the evenings, working through the German romantics until he understood that his inwardness was not an illness, but a vocation, There was the sudden fame of a first novel in his 20s, and the house he built for himself on Lake Constance, and the marriage and the 3 sons, and the slow discovery that a life arranged to look like an answer can be a very sophisticated way of avoiding the question. There was a voyage east in 1911 that failed in exactly the manner it needed to fail, delivering him not to the sacred Asia of his grandfather's bookshelves, but to colonial harbors and heat and illness, and sending him home with the understanding that the East he had been looking for was a direction and not a destination. There was the war, and his refusal of it, and the public savaging that refusal earned him from his own countrymen. There was the year in which his father died, and his youngest son fell gravely ill, and his wife's mind gave way, all of it inside a few months, and after which he himself could not go on and went into a sanatorium above Lucerne to sit 3 times a week with a doctor named Joseph Bernhard Lang, a student of Jung, and to be listened to, seriously and without judgment, perhaps for the first time in his life. There was the book that came out of that, published under another man's name, because his own no longer seemed to fit. And then, in May of 1919, with his household dissolved and his possessions reduced to what he could carry, there was a train south over the Alps to a village called Montagnola, above Lugano. 4 rented rooms in a crumbling Baroque villa, and the beginning of the freest and most productive stretch of his life. It was there, in the winter of 1919, that he began writing the story of the Brahmin's son. It was there that the writing stopped. For a year and a half, because he had reached the point in the story where the young man must stop searching and begin listening. And he found he could not write it, because he had not yet learned to do it himself. And it was there, when the book at last resumed, that he brought his seeker to the bank of a river and left him with an old ferryman who had learned nothing at all except how to attend. A man with no doctrine, no teaching, no words worth repeating, who claimed only that the water had taught him everything and that it could teach anyone who was willing to listen. That is the shape of the thing. A boy at a weir in Calw, watching water move past a tannery in 1891, and an old man in Montagnola, 60 years later, still writing about the same water. Everything in between is the long process by which he came to understand what he had been doing that evening without knowing it. His books have been read, in the century since, by a great many people who never intended to read philosophy at all. They have been carried in the rucksacks of the young and the restless, translated into dozens of languages, pressed into the hands of friends at exactly the moment those friends were beginning to suspect that the life arranged for them was not the life they were living. They are not read as systems. Nobody finishes them holding a doctrine. They are read, generation after generation, as something closer to a manual for hearing one's own life, for detecting, underneath the noise of instruction and expectation and one's own restless argument, the quieter sound of what is actually happening. That is an unusual kind of literary survival, and it belongs to a man who spent his whole career declining to tell anyone what to do. The journey ahead moves through the phases of that life in the order he lived them. It begins in the pietist house in Calw and Basel, with the grandfather who had spent decades in Malabar and kept Sanskrit books on his shelves, and with the child's first refusal, a boy of 13 announcing that he would be a poet or nothing at all, in a household where poetry was not among the recognized callings. It follows him out of Maulbronn and through the dark year afterward, into the clock factory, and then the bookshop, where he read himself into the romantics, and out of his despair, it arrives at the early fame of Peter Kamenzind and the house at Geinhofen, and the discovery that success can be a form of not listening. It goes east with him in 1911 and comes back disappointed and instructed. Then it enters the war, and the essay he published in November of 1914, begging the intellectuals of Europe not to let the fighting infect the mind, and the years of quiet work he did afterward, supplying books to interned soldiers, while his countrymen called him a traitor. It goes with him into the sanatorium, and the analysis, and the writing of Demian. It follows him over the Alps to Montagnola, into the four rooms, and the watercolours, and the chestnut woods, and into the long silence in the middle of Siddhartha, and the resumption that broke it. It stops for a while at the river itself, with the ferryman, because that is the centre of everything he ever thought. And then it moves on through the harder middle years, the wolf of the steppes, the two friends who are two halves of one temperament, and into the 11 years of labour on his final and largest book, written through the darkest decade of the century, and the Nobel Prize that came to him in 1946, when he was too tired and too far away to go and collect it, and the last quiet decades on the hillside, answering letters, watching the seasons come up the valley. The river neither hurries nor waits. It was there before the boy, and it went on afterward, and everything he wrote was an attempt to say what he had heard that evening at the weir, without ever quite reducing it to something that could be taught. The house he was born into on the 2nd of July, 1877, stood in a narrow street in Calw, a small town in the Black Forest, where the Nagold runs shallow and quick between old buildings, and the hills come down close on either side. And it was a house in which God was discussed daily, in specific terms, as one discusses a member of the household who is always present in the next room. His father, Johannes Hesse, was a Baltic German from Estonia, who had gone out to India as a missionary and come back after 3 years with his health broken by the climate. A gentle, scrupulous, frequently unwell man who kept his conscience under a bright light and expected others to do the same. His mother, Marie Gundert, had been born in Talacheri on the Malabar coast, the daughter of missionaries, and she had already buried one husband and borne 2 sons before she married Johannes, and began again. She wrote poetry. She kept diaries in which she examined her own soul with the thoroughness of a woman who believed nothing about herself was too small to be brought before heaven. Both of them loved their children with a warmth that nobody who knew the family ever doubted, and both of them believed with the same warmth that a child's will was a thing to be broken open so that grace could get in. That is the first fact of his life, and it is the fact everything else pushes against. Pietism, as it was practiced in that corner of Swabia, was not cold, and it was not cruel. It was intimate. It sang. It held prayer meetings in parlours, and read scripture aloud in the evening, and believed in a personal, immediate, conversational relationship with the divine. But it also held, as a settled matter, that the truth had already been given, that it came from outside the self, and that the task of a life was not to discover it, but to submit to it. Doctrine arrived first. The person was arranged around it afterward. A restless, gifted, difficult child in such a house was not ignored. He was attended to constantly, He was simply attended to as a problem to be corrected, rather than as a voice to be heard. And there is a great difference between those two kinds of attention, a difference the child felt long before he had any language for it. His mother's diaries record him, at 4 years old, as a boy of extraordinary energy and stubbornness, whom she found beautiful and exhausting in equal measure. He was, by every account including his own, a violent little tyrant of a child, prone to rages, quick with words, impossible to subdue and impossible to ignore. The family moved to Basel in 1881, where his father taught at the mission house, and came back to Calw 5 years later. And in both places the same pattern held. A boy of obvious gifts who could not be made to fit the shape prepared for him, and parents who understood his resistance as a spiritual condition requiring firmer treatment. But the house held something else as well, and it is the reason the story does not simply end in a small provincial rebellion. His maternal grandfather, Hermann Gundert, lived there too, and Hermann Gundert was one of the great Orientalists of the century. He had spent more than 20 years in Malabar, had learned Malayalam so thoroughly that he compiled the dictionary and the grammar that are still consulted, had translated scripture into that language, and had studied a good deal else besides. Now he ran the Calw Publishing Union, an old man with a white beard in a house full of books. And among those books, on shelves the boy could reach, were Sanskrit texts and Indian volumes, and things in scripts that nobody else in the town could read. The grandson would remember him always as a figure of enormous and slightly mysterious authority, the wisest person he ever knew, a man who seemed to contain whole continents, and to have brought them home quietly and put them on a shelf. This is the first river, though nobody standing in that room would have called it that. In the grandfather's study, India was not a doctrine. It was a presence, untidy, enormous, full of gods with too many arms and philosophies that did not answer to any catechism. And the boy absorbed it early and without instruction, the way a child absorbs the weather of a house. The mission's official position was that these things were error, to be met with the gospel, but the books were there, and the old man had loved the language he learned, and something of that love came through the wall of doctrine without permission. Decades later, when a European writer sat down in a hillside village to write about a Brahmin's son, he was not reaching for something exotic and far away. He was reaching back into a room he had played in. For a while, the boy's brilliance seemed to promise the family everything it wanted. He was clever, precociously literate, obviously destined for something. The Swabian path for such a child ran through the state examination, the Landexamen, and then into one of the Protestant seminaries, and from there to Tübingen and the ministry, and it was a good path, a respectable and even a beautiful one, and it had been walked by Hölderlin and by Hegel before him. He was sent away to Göppingen to be crammed for the examination by a formidable schoolmaster, and he passed it in the summer of 1891, one of the better candidates in the state. And in September, he entered the seminary at Maulbronn. He was 13. The place is a Cistercian monastery, and it is very beautiful. Cloisters, a fountain house, a fish pond, a Romanesque church, all of it set among woods and vineyards. And he responded to the beauty at once, and to the Greek and Latin, and to the reading. For a few months he was, by his own later account, reasonably happy there. And then, without warning, and without any grievance that he was ever able to name afterward. Something in him refused. Sometime that winter, he wrote the sentence to his parents that stands over the rest of his life, like a motto he could not have understood when he set it down, that he would be a poet, or else nothing at all. It is a child's sentence, absolute and slightly ridiculous, and it turned out to be exactly accurate. And it was, in the terms of that household, close to blasphemy, because it located the whole meaning of a life in a private calling that no scripture had authorized and no elder had approved. On a March morning in 1892, he walked out of the seminary and did not come back. He was gone the rest of that day, and the following night, out in open country in cold weather, and he was found the next day in a field, having slept somewhere in the dark, and brought back. He could give no reason. There was no plan. He'd simply been unable to remain, and the inability had come up through him with a force he could not argue with, and he had obeyed it before he could explain it, which is, in a sense, the only thing he ever did. What followed was the worst year of his life, and it needs to be told plainly and then set down again. He was punished at the seminary and then removed from it. He was sent to Bad Boll, to the household of the pastor, Christoph Blumhardt, a famous healer of souls, where his condition worsened rather than improved. In the summer, he was placed for some months in an institution at Stettin, a home for children with epilepsy and for the so-called feeble-minded, where he was watched and managed, and where he wrote letters home of a bitterness that must have been terrible to receive. Letters in which he told his parents that he had become a stranger to them, that he was being handled rather than helped. He was 14. He came out of it, went to a gymnasium in Cannstatt, endured another year, and left formal education for good in the autumn of 1893, with one modest certificate to his name and a reputation, at home and in the town. As a young man who had failed at everything, it would be easy to make that year darker than it needs to be. And he himself, when he came to write about it, refused to. He wrote of his parents afterward with real love and without any settling of scores. He understood, once he had children of his own, exactly how frightened they had been, and how little anyone then knew about what to do with a 14-year-old whose whole nature had gone into revolt. They had acted out of care, with the only instruments their world had given them. That is the ordinary shape of most damage between people who love each other. But something was learned in that year that never left him, and it is the thing this whole life turns on. Everyone around him had been talking. The teachers, the pastors, the doctors, the parents, the letters, the prayers. A great volume of speech directed at him. All of it well meant. All of it about him. None of it addressed to whatever it was in him that had walked out into a field in March and lain down. Not one of them had asked what he heard. They had known already, from the doctrine, what he ought to hear, and had spent that year trying to make the sound come out right. And so he arrived at 16 with almost nothing, no schooling, no prospects, no credit with anyone, except one small and durable discovery. The only voice he had any confidence in was the one nobody in the house had thought to listen to, the one underneath the arguments, that had refused the seminary without being able to say why, and had been proved right by everything that came after. He did not yet know what to do with it. He could not have defended it, but he had learned, at an age when most people are still being told who they are, that there was something in him that knew, and that it did not speak in sentences, and that it would have to be attended to rather than instructed. Everything he wrote afterward was an attempt to learn how to do that, and the first thing it required of him was work, the plainest, dullest, most patient work he could find. The work he found was in a clock factory in his own town, in the workshop of Heinrich Perro, where tower clocks were made and mended. And he went to it at 17 in the summer of 1894, with the air of a young man serving a sentence he had partly chosen. For something over a year, he stood at a bench and filed brass. Gear wheels came to him rough from the casting, and he took the burrs off their teeth and set them aside and took up the next one. It was not interesting. That was very nearly its virtue. Nothing in the task asked anything of the part of him that had been arguing for 3 years with everyone who loved him. And so that part of him was left alone for the first time since childhood. And in being left alone, it began to quiet. He learned, in that shop, a lesson his mind would have rejected if anyone had tried to teach it to him in words. He learned that patience is not a feeling, but a motion of the hands, that one may be entirely out of sympathy with one's situation and still do the next small thing well, and that the doing of it steadies something. The escapements he assembled had to be true, or the clock would gain and lose. There was no arguing with the mechanism. It either kept time or it did not, and no eloquence on his part altered the case. For a boy who had spent his adolescence surrounded by people whose certainties could not be tested by anything, the plain, unanswerable honesty of brass and steel came almost as a relief. And in the evenings, and at the bench when his hands went on without him, he read. He had been reading since he was small. The house was full of books, the publishing rooms of his grandfather full of more. But he read now with a different appetite. Not for approval and not for argument, but as a man drinks. His grandfather's library was still open to him, and so were the shelves of the town. And by the time the year in the workshop ended, he had made a private decision that he did not announce to anyone, because he had learned the cost of announcements. He would be a man of books, not a student of them, since that door had been shut by his own hand, but a servant of them, close to them daily, at whatever wage. So in October of 1895, he went to Tübingen, to the bookshop of Heckenhauer on the Holzmarkt, in the shadow of the collegiate church, in a town full of exactly the university students he would never be. He was 18. The apprenticeship was 3 years. The days were 12 hours long and began with crates, unpacking, sorting, stamping, shelving, carrying the theological folios that were the shop's specialty up and down the narrow stairs until his back ached, then standing behind the counter to answer the questions of undergraduates who were his own age and had come by the road he had refused. He earned almost nothing. He lived in a rented room. He was tired in a way that has no drama in it, but at the end of those 12 hours, the room was his, and the lamp was his, and there began the strangest and most fruitful education of his life. A self-taught curriculum pursued nightly for years by a young man with no teacher, no examination, and no one to impress. He read Goethe first and most, and kept reading him to the end of his life. And it was Goethe who gave him the idea that a life might be a work. that a person could be composed the way a poem is composed, by attention and revision rather than by conversion. He read Schiller, Lessing, Jean-Paul. Then he found the Romantics, and the Romantics found him, and something in him that had been waiting since the flight from the seminary at last recognized itself in print. It is hard to overstate what Novalis and Hölderlin and Eichendorff did for him at 19. He had been told by the whole apparatus of his upbringing that his inwardness was a symptom, the turning away from company, the moodiness, the sense of a music underneath ordinary life that others did not seem to hear. These had been treated as a disorder to be prayed over, and when prayer failed, confined. Now here were men who had made exactly that inwardness the center of their lives, and called it not sickness but vocation. Here was Novalis writing that the mysterious way goes inward. Here was a whole literature founded on the proposition that the deepest reality is not out in the arrangements of the world, but down in the listening self, and that the poet is simply the person who has consented to go down there and report what he finds. That was permission, and permission was what he needed. He did not need a doctrine. He had been raised on doctrine and had nearly been broken by it. He needed to be told that the thing he could not stop doing was allowed. The Romantics told him so. And they told him so in a language of forests and nights and rivers and homesickness that answered the exact shape of his temperament. And from that year onward, he never again seriously entertained the idea that he was ill. Odd, perhaps. Unfit for a great many ordinary purposes, certainly, but not ill. He began to write in earnest, and to send what he wrote out into a world that received it with almost perfect indifference. In 1899, at 22, he published a small volume of poems, romantic songs, at his own expense and at his own risk. 600 copies were printed. Something like 50 were sold. His mother, when she read them, was troubled by their worldliness, and said so, which wounded him more than the silence of the public. Later that same year came a book of prose sketches, An Hour Behind Midnight, dreamlike and heavily scented, the work of a young man in love with atmosphere. It sold hardly better, and yet the second book was noticed by one reader whose notice mattered. A young poet not much older than himself, Rainer Maria Rilke, who reviewed it with real attention and recognized in it a genuine and unusual voice. It changed nothing outwardly. There was no rush of publishers, no income, no release from the crates and the stairs. But to be heard once precisely by someone who knew what he was hearing is worth a great deal to a person who has spent his adolescence being talked at. He kept the fact of it, quietly, the way one keeps a coin. By the autumn of 1899, the apprenticeship was behind him, and he moved to Basel, where he had been born, and where he still had the family's connections, taking a post in a bookshop there, and later working among antiquarian stock, which suited him better still. Old books, slow trade, long hours in which nothing much happened. Basel in those years was a city with a particular air, and he breathed it consciously. Jacob Burckhardt had taught there, and had died only 2 years before, leaving behind a way of looking at history as the study of what human beings had made of themselves, culture as the record of the soul's attempts. Nietzsche had held a chair in that same university as a very young man, and had walked those same streets before the illness took him. And his books were now beginning their long detonation through German-speaking Europe. Hesse read him with the mixture of exhilaration and unease that Nietzsche produces in serious readers, and took from him not the hammer, but the question, the insistence that a man must become what he is, and that most people never trouble to find out what that might be. He walked a great deal. He was poor, and walking was free. And he had discovered in himself the temperament of a wanderer that would never afterward leave him. He walked out of the city along the Rhine, where the great river comes through in its wide green hurry, turning north at the bend, and he walked in the hills, and he took trips into Italy when he could scrape the fare, and he began, in those years, to look at water in a way he had not looked at it before. This is a small thing, and it is not a small thing. As a boy on the Nagold, he had watched the water because it was there and because it was better than the house. Now he began to attend to it as a subject. He noticed that a river is never the same water and is always the same river. He noticed that it makes a sound with no words in it, and yet the sound is not empty, that one can stand beside it for an hour and come away rested without having thought anything in particular. He noticed that it does not hurry and does not stop, and that of all the things in the visible world, it is the one least like an argument. He put rivers into his letters and his sketches and his poems. Badly at first, decoratively, as young writers do, using them as scenery for feelings. It would be more than 20 years before he understood what he had been circling. But the circling had begun on those long walks out of Basel, in a young man's shoes worn thin at the heel. What he had at the end of these years then was a great deal, and not yet enough. He had read himself awake. He had assembled, alone and at night, an education broader and more deeply his own than the seminary would ever have given him. And he had found in the romantics the sanction for his own nature that his family could not give. He had learned patience from brass gears and endurance from crates of theology, and had published 2 small books that almost nobody read. He was 23, competent, self-taught, and quietly certain of his vocation. But reading is not listening, and he did not yet know the difference. Reading is a taking in of what other minds have already made into words. It can be done greedily, and he had done it greedily, and it had built in him a fine and well-furnished interior that was still, for all its furniture, a room with the door shut. Listening is something else. Listening requires that one stops supplying the meaning. It requires a silence one has not filled in advance, and a willingness to be told something one had not already decided to hear. And he had come by his silences too easily so far. They had been solitude rather than attention. 30 years and a war and a collapse stood between him and that distinction. For the moment, he was a young man with a manuscript in his drawer about a boy from a mountain village, and the manuscript was about to make him famous. The manuscript was called Peter Kamenzind, and when it appeared in 1904, first serially in the Neue Rundschau, and then between covers from the Berlin house of Samuel Fischer, it did for its author in a matter of months what a decade of patient obscurity had not. He was 26. The book sold in numbers that startled everyone, including his publisher, and went on selling. It won him the Bauernfeld Prize. It brought letters from strangers who wrote as though they had recognized something of themselves on the page and needed to tell him so. He had gone to bed a bookseller's assistant with 2 thin volumes of verse to his name, and woke, more or less, as a German writer whose next book people would wait for. It is worth pausing over how quickly this happened, because the speed of it is part of what went wrong. The novel itself is a gentle thing, and it is easy now to see why it was loved. A boy grows up in a village in the Swiss mountains, above a lake, among people who work with their hands and do not have many words. He is clumsy and gifted and full of longing. He goes down into the cities and tries the life of the educated, the cafes, the reviews, the literary friendships, the drinking, and finds it thin. He loves and is not loved back, or not in the way he needed. He travels to Italy and reads St. Francis, and is moved by the idea of a man who spoke to birds and to the sun as though they were kin. And in the end, he goes home, back to the mountains, and takes care of a crippled man named Boppy, and learns in that small, unglamorous service more than the cities taught him, and is somehow made whole by clouds and stone, and by giving himself to another person's needs. That was the argument, that a man may be healed by nature and by service. It was an argument the young Hesse believed with his whole heart, and it was an argument he had not yet lived. He had seen the mountains. He had not been saved by them. He had read Francis. He had not nursed anyone. He had written, with real feeling and considerable skill, a novel about the cure for a sickness whose worst attacks were still ahead of him. There is no dishonesty in this. Young writers routinely write ahead of their lives, and the book's tenderness is genuine. But there is a kind of unearned resolution in it, a peace arrived at by imagination rather than by passage. The river in that book has been described rather than crossed. Success acted on him the way it acts on most people who receive it early. It made his life immediately more possible and immediately less questionable. He could marry now. In 1904, he married Maria Bernoulli, 9 years older than he was, a photographer, a member of the old Basel family that had produced generations of mathematicians, a woman of considerable seriousness and considerable reserve. And with the money from the book, and with a determination that looks in retrospect almost like a program, the two of them left the city altogether and went to live at Geienhofen, a village on the German shore of Lake Constance, in a peasant house without electricity or running water, reached by an unpaved road. He was, in other words, moving into his own novel. He would live simply, near water, among farmers. He would grow his own vegetables and keep bees and write in the mornings and row in the afternoons. He would be Peter Kamenzind, returned to the mountains. And the sickness of the literary cities would not reach him there. Later, they built a proper house of their own on a rise outside the village, with a garden he laid out himself, fruit trees, a view down the slope toward the great pale sheet of the lake and the Swiss shore beyond it. 3 sons came: Bruno, Heiner, Martin. Photographs from those years show a lean young man in a smock among his plants, looking exactly like what he intended to look like. And out of that house came the second book, Beneath the Wheel, in 1906, which is where he settled the Maulbronn account. It is the story of Hans Giebenrath, a gifted boy from a small town who is fed to the examination system by a father and a schoolmaster and a pastor who all imagine they are doing him a kindness, and who is drilled and honoured and drilled again until something in him quietly gives way. He is sent home. He is apprenticed to a mechanic. He does not recover. The novel is written with an eerie calm, without shouting. And and that calm is the calm of a man who got out. Hesse had run from his own seminary at 14 and been fetched back and passed through a difficult year of being handled by people convinced they knew what he required. Here he gave that year to a boy who did not escape it, and let the reader see the machinery from the outside. It remains, more than a century on, one of the truest books ever written about what schooling can do to a child. It has decided to be proud of. He never wrote about that period again with such directness. He did not need to. It was paid. But the idyll on the lake, this is the strange, slow discovery of the Geisenhofen years, was a set. It had been built rather than found. Everything in it had been chosen in advance to mean something. The simplicity meant integrity. The garden meant rootedness. The marriage and the sons meant that a restless man had come to rest. And a life arranged so carefully to signify is a life in which very little can be heard, because the answers have all been placed in position before the questions arrive. He began to feel it first as boredom, which is how such things usually begin. The village that was to have been his community turned out to consist of farmers who had no particular use for a novelist, and a novelist who had no particular means of speaking to farmers. The isolation he had gone looking for did not resolve into the companionable rural belonging of Kamenzind. It stayed isolation. Winters on Lake Constance are long and grey and wet. The fog sits on the water for weeks, and there is nothing at all to do. He rode. He walked. He wrote a great many short stories and reviews and feuilletons, because there were now 3 children and a house, and the writing that had once been a vocation began quietly to become a trade. He could produce. He knew how to produce. And knowing how is precisely the danger. Work that comes easily can be turned out for years without ever again requiring its author to find anything out. The marriage cooled. It is a delicate thing to describe from this distance, and it deserves to be described without blame in either direction. Maria was a private, self-contained woman who had married a young man of great charm and greater need. She suffered in the loneliness of the house as much as he did, and she had less recourse. He could always leave for a lecture tour or a walking trip, and increasingly he did. He was often away. When he was at home, he required silence for his work and got it. And silence given by request is not the same as silence shared. 2 people can be extremely kind to one another, and still, over a decade, stop speaking about anything that matters. There were no dramatic ruptures at Geisenhofen. There was only the slow accumulation of things not said, and the discovery, arriving on both sides at about the same time, that the house they had built together had become a place they inhabited separately. He wrote his way around the edge of this. Gertrude in 1910 is a book about a musician who cannot have the woman he loves and makes his art out of the shortfall. A novel of some beauty and a good deal of self-pity, which its author afterward judged harshly. He was aware, more sharply than his admirers were, that something had gone slack. The letters of those years contain a note that never appears in the public prose. A low, persistent complaint that he did not know what he was for, that the writing was not going anywhere, that the country life he had recommended to 100,000 readers had not delivered to him what he had promised them. The books kept selling. That was, in its way, the worst of it. There was no external failure to force a reckoning, only the private knowledge that he was repeating himself with increasing skill. And here is the shape of the trap, which is worth naming plainly. because it is the reason this phase belongs in his story at all, rather than being a lull between more interesting periods. He had made a picture of the good life, and then moved into the picture. And once inside it, he could no longer test it. Every element of the arrangement, the lake, the garden, the wife, the boys, the smock, argued that the question had been answered. And so the question could no longer be asked. He had built himself a very beautiful room and shut the door, exactly as he had done with his reading a decade earlier. Only this time, the room had windows and a view and 3 children in it, which made it far harder to see as a room. To arrange a life so that it looks like an answer is one of the most complete forms of not listening available to a human being, because it silences the only voice that could correct it. One's own, at the hour when it has something inconvenient to say. He was 34. He had a public, a house, a family, and a reputation as the poet of homecoming and simple things. And he was quietly certain, in the way one is certain about matters one has not yet spoken aloud, that he could not stay. What he did with that certainty was the obvious thing, the thing restless men have always done when the room grows small. He decided to go a very long way away. In the autumn of 1911, he boarded a ship at Genoa, bound for the east, carrying his grandfather's Asia with him in his luggage, expecting to find it waiting at the other end. The voyage began in September of 1911, and it did not go where the name of it suggested. He travelled with the painter, Hans Sturzenegger, a friend from Schaffhausen with an eye for colour and a steadier stomach, and the itinerary took them down through the Red Sea and out across the Indian Ocean to Ceylon, then on to Sumatra, to Penang, to Singapore, to the Malay coast and the settlements of the Strait. They saw harbours, plantations, mountain roads, temples, rubber estates, hotel verandas. What they did not see, in the end, was India itself. The heat worked on him steadily. The food disagreed. And somewhere among the ports, he contracted the dysentery that emptied him out and turned him homeward before the mainland he had been dreaming of since childhood could be reached. The journey to India, in the plain sense of the phrase, never happened. He came within sight of it and turned back sick. And that is the fact the whole episode rests upon. It would be easy to tell this as a small comedy of a bookish man defeated by the tropics. And he told it that way himself at times, with the dryness he used whenever he wanted to keep an experience at a manageable distance. But the failure was more interesting than the trip he had planned, and he knew it almost immediately, which is why the notes he gathered afterwards under the title of an Indian journey are not travel writing in the ordinary sense at all. They are the record of a man discovering that he has been looking for something in the wrong dimension entirely, and that the discovery is worth more than the thing he was looking for. What he had carried aboard at Genoa was his grandfather's Asia, Hermann Gundert's decades in Malabar, the dictionaries and grammars, the shelves of Sanskrit and Malayalam, the smell of that study, the atmosphere of a place spoken of at the family table, as though it were a real address one might one day visit. All of that had settled in him as a picture, and the picture was of an older, slower, more inward world, where the questions that tormented Europe had long ago been quietly resolved. He expected, without ever quite admitting the expectation to himself, to disembark into that picture. What he disembarked into was the machinery of empire. The ports were commercial before they were anything else. Coal, copra, rubber, tin, freight. the whole apparatus of extraction running on schedule. The Europeans he met in the hotels were merchants and officials and planters, and they talked about profit and climate and the failings of local labour with the flat confidence of men who had never once wondered whether they belonged where they stood. The missionary compounds were tidy and well-meaning and full of the same certainties he had fled from Calw to escape, transplanted intact into hotter weather. The temples were open to visitors and full of visitors, and the sacred East, the one from the shells, was not visible anywhere, because it was not the kind of thing that stands on a quay waiting to be collected. He was harder on the Europeans than on anyone, he wrote afterwards, with real anger under the mildness of the spectacle of a race that had conquered half the world and could not say what it had conquered it for, of white men sweating in linen suits, drinking too much on verandas, contemptuous of the people whose country they were profitably standing in, and unable to be alone with themselves for a single evening. He recognized in them, uncomfortably, the same restlessness that had put him on the ship. They had come east for money, and he had come east for meaning. But both were forms of taking, and both assumed that what a man lacked at home could be fetched from somewhere else. That recognition cost him something. It is one thing to be disappointed by a place. It is quite another to notice that one has arrived in it as a variety of tourist, hoping to be handed a piece one has not done the work to deserve. There were, all the same, hours that stayed with him for the rest of his life. And characteristically, they were the quiet ones, rather than the picturesque. He climbed Pedro Talagala in Ceylon, the high peak above Nuwara Eliya, going up through the tea country in the early cold and coming out at the top into cloud and thin air, and a view over ridges falling away into mist. He had expected, he admitted, some kind of arrival at the summit, the standard reward of the romantic ascent, the vision, the clarification. What he found was a bare hill, a wind, and the ordinary fact of having climbed it, and the honesty with which he recorded that absence is the first genuinely new note in his writing. Nothing was given. The mountain was only a mountain, and yet he came down changed, in the sluggish way that matters, having been shown that the arrangement he had relied on all his life, go far enough, climb high enough, read deeply enough, and the answer will be delivered, did not hold, and he found something in the faces. Not wisdom, he was careful about that word afterwards, and not the serenity that European visitors were forever discovering in people whose language they could not speak. What he saw in the villages and on the roads and in the crowded riverside quarters was an older relation to time. People waiting without impatience. Work done at the pace the work required. Old men sitting for long stretches doing nothing that could be described as doing, and doing it without the low hum of guilt that would have attended the same stillness in Swabia. He could not enter that relation to time, and he did not pretend to. But he had now seen it existing in the world, which meant it was possible, which meant that his own hurry was not simply the human condition, but a local habit he had been taught. The turn came on the return voyage, in the long, empty days at sea, with the illness draining out of him, and nothing to look at but water. He had gone east to find the east, and had found ports, and the conclusion available to him was either that the east he wanted did not exist, or that it was not a location. He chose the second, and the choice organized the rest of his working life. The Asia he had been reaching for was a direction rather than a destination, a way of standing towards one's own existence that his grandfather had happened to encounter in Malabar, and that Lao Tzu had encountered in China, and that could, in principle, be encountered on a hillside above Lake Constance by a man who stopped insisting on being somewhere else. He would say later, in one form or another, and many times, that Europe's sickness was not that it lacked the wisdom of the East, but that it lacked the capacity to be quiet long enough to receive any wisdom at all. The journey had failed in the way that useful journeys fail. It had exhausted an option, and by exhausting it, closed a door he might otherwise have spent decades trying to open. He came home to Geienhofen, thinner, browner, and no longer able to live there. The house he had built with such care now announced its own smallness the moment he walked back into it, and within months, the family gave it up. In 1912, they moved to Bern, into a house that had belonged to the painter, Albert Welty, who had died the year before. It was a curious, half-haunted arrangement, living among another man's rooms, another man's garden, another man's studio light, and something of that borrowed quality entered the work at once. What came out of it was Rosholder, published in 1914, and it is the least consoling book he had yet written. It is the portrait of a painter of established reputation, living on a beautiful estate, with a wife who no longer speaks to him except about arrangements, the two of them dividing the house between them, like a border settled by treaty, and a small son who is the only remaining line of communication across it. Nothing dramatic occurs for most of the book. The couple are civil. The work continues. The estate is lovely, and the light on the water is described with real tenderness. And the whole thing is airless, because two people are living side by side in the same house without hearing one another, and the failure is not anybody's fault, which is what makes it unbearable. When the child falls ill, the last bridge goes, and the painter's freedom arrives in the only form such freedom ever takes. As a loss, he did not choose. He was writing about his own marriage, and he knew it. And he was writing it before he had decided anything, which gives the novel its strange, level, unpleading tone. He had gone to the other side of the world to escape a silence, and had brought the silence back with him in his luggage. Maria was withdrawing further into her own weather. He was travelling constantly now to give readings, and the travelling was no longer an interruption of his life, but the shape of it. The book ends with its painter setting out for India, which its author had already tried, and which had already failed. And there is a hard little honesty in that ending. The escape is offered as an escape, and simultaneously known to be none. So the outer journey was finished. He had used up the great remaining fantasy, that somewhere on the map there was a country where the question he carried would not follow him, and having used it up, he was left with the only route not yet attempted, which led inward, and for which he had at that moment no method, no teacher, and no vocabulary. He was 37 years old, living in a dead man's house, married to a woman he could not reach, and quietly aware that everything he had built since the age of 25 had been dismantled by an illness in a hot climate and a walk up a hill that gave him nothing. Rosholder was published in the spring of 1914. It was reviewed warmly. He was in Bern, planning nothing in particular, when the summer came on, and the summer was the summer of 1914. And in August, the whole of Europe stopped listening at once. He was in Bern when the mobilization notices went up, and like most men of his generation, he felt first the pull rather than the horror. The pull was real. and should not be tidied away. He had been living for 2 years in a house that felt like a held breath, in a marriage that had gone quiet, in the way rooms go quiet when both people have learned what not to say. And here suddenly was a summons that seemed to promise something larger than a private difficulty, a common purpose, a fever of belonging, whole cities singing in the streets. He presented himself as a volunteer. He was 37, nearsighted to the point of near uselessness in any practical military sense, and the examining officers turned him down without much ceremony. He was declared unfit for service and assigned instead to the German consular office in Bern, and from there to the welfare service for prisoners of war. It is worth pausing on how ordinary that assignment looked and how completely it would reshape him. He was not sent anywhere. He did not see a front or a field hospital. He was given a desk, and then more desks, and then an office of his own with clerks in it. And the work was the sorting and dispatch of books to men held in camps across France and Germany and Russia. Requests came in on printed cards. Titles were located, ordered, wrapped, and sent. Lists were kept. Complaints were answered. A newspaper for the interned was established, and then a small publishing house. And eventually the operation was sending out tens of thousands of volumes a year, and the man overseeing it was a novelist who had been famous for writing about lakes and boyhood and mountain villages, and who now spent his days on postal regulations and the price of paper. He did this for the entire duration of the war, nearly 5 years. It is the least romantic labor imaginable, and he never once described it as heroic. But something in him understood it as the correct work. And later, when he wrote about attention as a form of service, the years of parcels stood quietly behind the sentences. A prisoner writes, asking for Goethe. Somebody must find the Goethe. There is no philosophy in the transaction, and no visible result. The book goes into a sack, and the sack goes onto a train, and nothing comes back except, occasionally, a card of thanks written in pencil. He was learning, without naming it, that mercy is mostly tedium, and that the practice of it consists not in grand feeling, but in showing up on a Tuesday to do again what was done on Monday. But in the first autumn of the war, he did something else. Oh, and it cost him nearly everything he had. The intellectuals of Germany had gone to war more enthusiastically than the soldiers. Professors were publishing manifestos. Poets were producing hymns to the sword. Scholars who had spent their lives on Homer or on Kant were signing declarations that the enemy's culture was worthless and its language a barbarism. In November of 1914, the Neue Zürcher Zeitung carried an essay by Hesse under a title borrowed from Schiller by way of Beethoven's Ninth, the line that interrupts the symphony's last movement to sweep away the music that came before it and call for something else. Oh, friends, not these tones. The argument was mild by any later standard. He did not oppose the war as such. He was not yet capable of that. And honesty requires saying so. What he opposed was the enlistment of the mind. Let the soldiers fight, he wrote in effect, since they must. But let the thinkers and the artists hold open the one space where the enemy is still a person, because if that space closes, there will be nothing to come home to. Culture, he insisted, was the thing that belonged to no nation. To conscript it was to destroy the very asset the war was supposedly defending. He expected some disagreement. what arrived was not disagreement. The German press turned on him with a completeness that surprised even his opponents. He was called a traitor, a defector, a man who had grown rich in Switzerland while better men bled. Newspapers that had reviewed him tenderly for a decade now printed columns about his cowardice. Booksellers returned stock. Friends of 20 years stopped writing, and a few wrote to explain why they were stopping, which was worse. Anonymous letters came in quantity, and he kept some of them. And there is a photograph in the mind of a man at a desk in Bern, opening the morning's mail and finding in it, alongside the request cards from prisoners, a page of abuse from a stranger who had once bought his novels. He wrote to his publisher that he had not known a person could be so thoroughly disowned for saying so little. He did not retract. That is the fact that matters. Over the following 4 years, he published more than 30 further pieces in the same vein, growing steadily more explicit. And he went on running the book service, and the two activities were the same activity conducted at different volumes. But something in him took the blow inwardly and did not let it go. He had spent his whole life believing that if a thing were said clearly enough, it would be heard. The war had just demonstrated, at continental scale, that a thing said clearly is not heard at all when the ear has already decided. He had counselled Europe to listen. Europe had answered by informing him that he was a traitor, and had gone on shouting. Then came 1916, and the year did to his private life what the war had done to his public one. His father died in March. Johannes Hesse had been a difficult inheritance. The pietist rigour, the mission house certainties, the long assumption that his son's independence was a symptom rather than a nature. But he had also been the origin of everything, the first voice, the man in whose house the boy had first learned what it feels like to be spoken at rather than spoken with. Hesse arrived too late for the death itself. He wrote afterwards that he had never understood how much of his own resistance had been shaped in relation to that one man until the man was no longer there to resist. His youngest son, Martin, fell seriously ill that same season, and the illness dragged on in the way children's illnesses did in those years, without a clear name or a clear end, requiring the boy to be sent away to be nursed by others. And Maria, who had been withdrawing for years into her own weather, who came from a family in which such weathers ran deep, and who was raising 3 boys in a foreign city, while her husband disappeared each day into an office, and each evening into a manuscript. Maria's mind gave way. She was taken into care. There is no need to describe more than that. And he himself never did in public. The household simply ceased to exist. The children were placed with friends and in boarding arrangements. The house in Bern held 1 man and a great deal of furniture. 3 collapses inside a single year, laid on top of 4 years of parcels and abuse. He began to suffer headaches that made reading impossible, sleeplessness that no amount of walking would cure, and periods in which he sat at the desk from morning to afternoon and produced nothing at all. Neuralgia in the eyes, a trembling in the hands. He described it later, with the flatness people use for such things, as a straightforward breaking down. The machinery had simply stopped, and no act of will would restart it. What is worth noticing, and it is the hinge of the entire life, is what he did not do. He did not go back. There was a version of this story available to him in which the ruined man returns to the pieties of the Calw house, or to the consolations of the early novels, with their healing lakes and their kindly mountains, and reassembles himself out of the materials he had been issued as a child. That version would have been perfectly respectable, and it would have ended his development. He was too honest to take it. The nature mysticism of Peter Kamenzind had been written by a young man who had not yet been tested. It could not carry a 40-year-old whose marriage had ended in a clinic and whose country had called him a traitor for asking it to stay human. The doctrine he had refused at 13 was still refusable at 39, and now there was nothing in its place. So he stayed in the wreckage, which is the harder thing, and he waited in it without a method. He had said to Europe that the mind must be kept open when everything else closes. The war had not taken his advice, and now, in the small hours of that barren house, he discovered that he could not take it either, that his own mind had shut as tightly as any newspapers, that he could not hear his sons, could not hear his wife, could not hear the sentences in his own manuscripts, and could hear nothing at all but the grinding noise of a self that had run out of instructions. The irony was not lost on him, and he did not soften it. The counsellor of listening had gone deaf. That spring, on the advice of a doctor, and with the last of his practical energy, he took a train to a sanatorium at Sonmat, in the hills above Lucerne, where a physician had agreed to see him. He went expecting rest. What he found was a small, intent, rather unfashionable man who had studied under Jung, and who proposed, instead of rest, a series of conversations in which nothing would be prescribed and nothing corrected, in which the patient would say what came and the doctor would attend to it as though it mattered. He had been in the world for 39 years and had been treated as a case, a scandal, a promise, a brand, a husband, an employee, and a traitor. He had never, in all that time, been listened to. It began in April. The consulting room at Sonmat was small and plain, with a window that gave onto pine, and a chair placed at an angle rather than across a desk. And in it, Joseph Bernhard Lang did almost nothing that the age understood as medicine. He did not examine. He did not prescribe rest cures or cold water, or the long silences of the moral hygienist. He asked what had happened in the night, and then he waited. And the waiting was the treatment. Between the spring of 1916 and the late autumn of the following year, the two men met something like 72 times. At first several times a week, later at longer intervals, and the record of those hours survives mainly in the changed man who walked out of them. Lang was 33, a physician trained in Zurich who had come under the influence of Jung and who carried the new depth psychology in the manner of a convert rather than a professional, with a passion for Gnostic texts, medieval alchemy, mythologies, the whole crowded attic of images that the official science of the mind was then busy tidying away. He was not an elegant man, and he was not a fashionable one. He was, however, entirely serious about the proposition that the material rising nightly from a person's sleep was not refuse, but message, and that a life could be read in the way a difficult manuscript is read, slowly, with the assumption that the obscurity is the author's meaning and not the author's failure. For a man raised in the pietist house at Calw, the shock of this was almost physical. He had been taught from the cradle that the interior life was a place of danger, that its promptings were to be brought under the authority of Scripture and the household, and, if they proved stubborn, corrected by others who knew better. every institution that had handled him since: the seminary, the sanatorium at Stettin, the clock factory, the reviewing press, the marriage, the war office, had operated on some version of that assumption. Now a doctor sat in a plain chair and proposed the opposite: that the dream about the sparrowhawk, the recurring house with the locked upper room, the figure who kept appearing at the edge of things and would not give a name, were not symptoms to be relieved, but statements to be understood, and that the patient was the only person on earth qualified to understand them. What he was being offered, though neither of them used the word in that way, was attention. He wrote afterwards that the analysis had shown him a path he might otherwise never have found, and the ordinary tone of the remark conceals what it cost him to accept it. He filled notebooks. He drew. He began, at 40, to paint in watercolor. Badly at first, and then with a real and startling gift, largely because Lang treated the impulse to paint as information rather than distraction. And slowly, the figures that had been crowding the borders of his sleep were given names, and having been named, stopped besieging him and began instead to speak. The chief of them was the one the new psychology called the shadow, the disowned portion. Everything the good son of a missionary house had been obliged to leave outside the door in order to be admitted. It had been out there a long time. It had been gathering, and what he came to see over those hours in the pines above Lucerne was that his collapse had not been caused by the war or the death or the failure of the marriage, though those had brought it on, as weather brings on a landslide. It had been caused by 40 years of refusing to hear one entire half of himself, and the war had merely arranged the conditions under which that half could no longer be shouted down. He met Jung himself some years later, in 1921, in Küsnacht on the lake, and submitted for a time to a course of analysis with the older man. The relation was never simple. He admired the reach of the mind and mistrusted the gravitational pull of the personality. He took what he needed and declined, courteously and firmly, to become a member of anything. He had spent his boyhood escaping one system of salvation, and he was not going to install another at 50. It is a small refusal, easily overlooked, and it is the whole of his method. Every teacher in his books is loved, learned from, and finally walked away from, because a teaching that can be joined is a teaching that has stopped being alive. Out of those Lucerne hours, in a matter of weeks in the autumn of 1917, came a short novel written at a speed he had not known since youth. It is the story of a boy called Emile Sinclair, brought up in a bright, orderly, respectable house, who discovers that there is a second world running alongside the first, a world of servants' quarters and rumours and violence and desire, and who is taught by a strange, calm schoolfellow named Max Demian that the two worlds are not good and evil, but simply the two halves of what is, and that a person who consents to live in only one of them has consented to live half a life. Sinclair is bullied, tempted, lost, and slowly, painfully assembled. Demian, who may not be a boy at all, appears whenever the assembling stalls. The famous sentence sits at the center of the book, like a stone dropped in water. The bird fights its way out of the egg, Sinclair reads, in a note that comes to him from he knows not where. The egg is the world, and whoever would be born must first destroy a world. The god to whom the bird flies is named Abraxas, a deity out of the old Gnostic papyri, who contains light and darkness together and refuses to be divided into a comfortable half. It is not a comfortable image, and it was never meant to be one. It says that the pietist house, the seminary, the idyll at Geinhofen, the patriotic certainty of 1914, the whole warm shell of inherited arrangement in which a person is raised, must at some point be broken from the inside by the thing it was built to protect, and that the breaking will feel exactly like destruction, because it is. But the sentence that gives the book its ache is the quieter one at the opening, where Sinclair says that he wanted only to live in accord with the promptings that came from his true self, and asks why that should have been so very difficult. There is no self-pity in it. It is the question of a man who has finally noticed that everything difficult in his life has followed from the simplest desire he ever had. He did not put his own name on it. The manuscript went to the publisher Fisher as the work of Emile Sinclair, and Fisher, who knew, kept the secret. It appeared in the summer of 1919 into a Germany that had lost a war, an emperor, and a coherent account of itself, and it was read by returning soldiers and by students in unheated rooms, as though it had been written that morning about them personally. Nothing else was speaking to them. The books of the older generation still assumed a world with a flaw in it. This one assumed the flaw was gone, and asked what a person does next. Because Sinclair was taken for a young author, the book was awarded the Fontaine Prize, which was reserved for a first work. The disguise did not survive long. A Zurich critic with a good ear noticed that the sentences belonged unmistakably to the author of Demian's predecessors, and the letters began. He returned the prize. There was no theatre in the gesture, and he made no statement about it beyond the necessary one. The point of the pseudonym had never been mischief. He had needed to write a book that his own reputation could not enter, a book in which the gentle laureate of Peter Kamenzind, the lyrical friend of lakes and villages, had no standing whatever, and the only way to get such a book written was to publish it as someone else, and for a while to be someone else. It is worth pausing on how strange and how consistent this is. In order to speak in his own voice, he had to abandon his own name. The 2 years that followed the analysis undid what remained of his old life, though undid is too violent a word for something that had been finished for years, and merely lacked a signature. Maria's illness had passed into a long institutional care, and the marriage, which had been silent since Bern, was formally set aside. The house at Bern was given up. The sons were placed with friends and in boarding schools, a decision he never defended and never entirely forgave himself for, and which the later books circle again and again in the figures of fathers who cannot hold their children. The war ended in November of 1918, and Europe began the peculiar business of pretending to resume. He had nothing to resume. What he had instead was an emptiness he now knew how to read. That was the whole difference the plain room at Sonmat had made. In 1916, the emptiness had been a symptom and a terror. By the spring of 1919, it was a condition of the work, the necessary clearing, the state that had to be entered rather than escaped. He was 41. He owned a few books, a rucksack, some paints, and the copyright of a novel published under another man's name. In May of that year, with the fruit trees out and the passes just open, he took a train south through the Gotthard and down into the Ticino, where the air changes and the roofs go flat and the language turns to Italian, and got out at Lugano and walked up the hill to a village called Montagnola to find a room. The room he found was not a room, but a suite of 4 in a strange building. And the strangeness of it mattered more than he could have known at the time. The Casa Camuzzi had been built in the previous century by a local architect who had worked in Russia and had come home with the memory of palaces in his hand, and who had then reproduced that memory in miniature on a hillside above Lugano, so that the house had balconies where no balconies were needed, a rounded corner tower, ornamental plaster, and a garden falling away in terraces toward the lake. It was a small nobleman's fantasy, set among vineyards. Its rooms were high, and its windows tall, and its rent, by the standards of a man with almost nothing, was still low enough that he could take 4 of them and heat 1. He moved in with a rucksack and some paints and a very few books. He was 42 years old, without a household, without a country he could comfortably return to, without a wife, without his children under his roof, and without, for the first time since he had been a boy, filing brass gears in Calw, any obligation whatsoever to anybody's expectation of him. What he felt in those first weeks was not grief, though grief was somewhere in the building. It was closer to the sensation of a man who has been carrying furniture up a staircase for 20 years and has finally set it down and discovered that the ache in his arms is not permanent. That first summer went off in him like a fever. He walked out at dawn into the chestnut woods. He sat in the vineyards through the long southern afternoons with the lake below going white with heat, and he wrote at a speed he had not known since his 20s, and with none of the machinery that had made the Geienhofen years so competent and so dead. Out of that summer came the short novel he called Klingsor's Last Summer, the story of a painter burning through his final season, in colours too strong for the eye. A man who knows the light is going, and answers it by painting harder. The book is a self-portrait taken at the exact temperature of that year. It is drunk on the Ticino, on the red of the wine and the violet of the mountains at evening, on figs and stone walls, and the sense of everything being both dying and inexhaustible at once. He never wrote anything else quite so hot. The painting was part of it, and the painting was new. He had begun with watercolours during the war years as a kind of therapy, small landscapes made in the intervals of clerical mercy, and now they became a daily practice, as serious to him as prose. He would take a folding stool and a paint box into the hills, and he would sit in front of a village with its ochre roofs and its campanile, and try to get down what the light was doing to it. He was not a great painter, and knew it. What painting gave him was something writing had stopped giving him, an act of attention with no argument in it. To paint a hillside, one has to look at the hillside, and one cannot look at a hillside and simultaneously explain oneself to Germany. He said more than once, in letters of those years, that the paints had saved his sanity. It was the plainest possible schooling in the thing he had been circling all his life without a name for it, which was attention paid to what is actually there. He wandered too on foot and constantly, with a notebook, and the small book that came of it, Wandering, is a record of a man learning the countryside of his freedom. It has farmhouses in it, and a chapel, and clouds, and a good deal of quiet argument with the idea of home. He was, by then, a Swiss citizen again by choice, and a German writer by trade, homeless in a way that had become a discipline rather than a wound. And in December of 1919, in that high cold room with a stove that never quite warmed it, he began the book that everything before had been the preparation for. He began it easily, the first part of Siddhartha, came almost as fast as Klingsor had, and it came in a prose unlike anything he had written before, stripped and formal and slightly raised off the ground, the sentences moving with the repetition of scripture. A Brahmin's son grows up beloved and gifted in a house of ritual, learns everything his father can teach him, and finds that the learning does not reach the place in him where the thirst is. So he leaves. He goes out with the wandering ascetics into the forest, and starves, and masters the disciplines of endurance, until he can say of himself, with the pride of a young man who has acquired instruments, that he can think, he can wait, he can fast. And then he meets the Buddha himself, the perfected one, the man in whom the goal has plainly been reached, and does the extraordinary thing that the whole book turns on. He declines to become his follower, not because the teaching is false, because it is a teaching, and a teaching is a thing received, and what he needs cannot be received. Hesse wrote all of that, and then stopped, and could not go on, and did not go on for a year and a half. He was honest about the blockage in his letters, more honest than a man protecting a reputation would have been. He wrote to friends that he had brought his Indian to the threshold, and could not follow him across it. And the reason he gave was not literary. He said he could not write the second half of the book because he had not lived it. He could describe the young ascetic's refusal with perfect authority, since he had been refusing since Malbron. What lay beyond the refusal, the descent into the world, the years of appetite and money and error, and then the strange, quiet knowledge that arrives on the far side of all that. He had no right to. A novelist can invent an emperor. He cannot invent serenity, so he went back to the reading, which had never entirely stopped since his grandfather's shelves. He went through the Upanishads again, and the Bhagavad Gita, and the Buddhist scriptures in the translations then available, and he read the Tao Te Ching of Lao Tzu and the sayings of Chuang Tzu, and it was the Chinese books, oddly, more than the Indian ones, that began to loosen the knot. The Indian texts gave him renunciation and the great unity behind appearances. The Chinese gave him something he needed more urgently: water. The image of the yielding thing that wears down the hard thing, the low place that everything runs into, the sage who does not strive. He fasted in imitation of his character, and got thin and worried his few neighbours. He tried for a period to write in the mornings by discipline, and produced nothing worth keeping. The crisis was, in the end, exactly the crisis of the book. A European of pietist stock, grandson of a missionary, was attempting to write the interior life of an Indian holy man, and every honest instinct told him that he was reaching for a doctrine that was not his. In a landscape he had visited only as a disappointed tourist 8 years before. In a spiritual vocabulary he had inherited second-hand from a grandfather's bookshelves. He had gone to Ceylon looking for the East and found harbours and traders. Now he had gone into the Sanskrit looking for the East and was finding again a magnificent system that belonged to somebody else. He was doing at 44 what he had done at 13, which was to hunt through other people's holiness for permission to have his own. What broke it was not a discovery. It was a relinquishing, and it happened slowly enough that no letter records the hour. He stopped at some point in the winter of 1921 and the spring that followed, trying to find the teaching. He gave up the idea that the second half of the book required him to arrive at a formulation, a doctrine of unity he could set down in words and have his character utter, and he began instead simply to attend to what was in front of him, which was a hillside in the Ticino, a lake changing colour 4 times in an afternoon, chestnut trees, weather, the sound of water in the irrigation channels of the vineyards, the peasants going up and down the path below the house with their tools, his own hand holding a brush. He had spent a lifetime believing that the answer was somewhere he had not yet gone. What the block finally taught him, by refusing to lift until he learned it, was that the answer had no location at all, and that the mistake of every seeker is the seeking itself, the perpetual leaning forward that guarantees the present moment goes unheard. The line that would eventually sit at the heart of the finished book says as much with a plainness that took him 18 months to earn, that wisdom cannot be imparted, and that wisdom a wise man tries to impart always sounds like foolishness to somebody else. He had written it, in effect, against his own trade. He was a man who made his living putting understanding into sentences, saying that understanding does not travel in sentences. It travels only by being lived, and its only reliable teacher is whatever happens to be present, patiently and without commentary, in front of one's own life. Once he had that, he had the ferryman. And once he had the ferryman, he had the river, and the second half of Siddhartha came out of him in a matter of weeks in the spring of 1922, in the same raised, unhurried prose as the first, as though it had been waiting downstream all along for the man to stop running along the bank and simply sit down at the water and listen. The ferryman enters the book almost without introduction, and that is the point of him. He has no doctrine, no following, no name that anyone in the story repeats with reverence, no history of study. He rows people across a river and back again. He keeps a hut. He grows rice. He mends his boat. And when he speaks so little that the young man who first meets him remembers him mostly as a quality of attention rather than as a person. Hesse had spent his life among men of learning, the pietist theologians of his childhood, the philologists of Tübingen, the analysts of Lucerne and Zurich, the writers and editors of Berlin and Munich. And when at last he came to make a figure who possessed what he wanted, he made him illiterate in everything except water. Vasudeva claims no wisdom of his own. He says only that the river taught him, and that anyone might learn the same, since the river withholds nothing and speaks to everybody. What the ferryman has is not knowledge, but a way of receiving. Siddhartha notices it before he understands it, that when he speaks to this quiet man, his own words come back to him clarified, that his confessions do not meet judgment or advice, but something like a wide surface on which they can be seen. Hesse wrote of him that he listened with a stillness that let the speaker's words flow into him without being lost, without being hurried, without being answered before they were finished, and that this was among the rarest of all human abilities. It is a description of the thing Hesse himself had been denied at every crisis of his early life, at Maulbronn, at Stettin, in the letters from his father, in the newspapers of 1915, and it is also a description of what Dr. Lung had finally offered him in a consulting room near Lucerne. The ferryman is analysis without theory. He is the pietist confessional, emptied of its creed and left with only its patience. The river teaches by a single central instruction, and the book returns to it again and again, in different lights and seasons, as though hoping the reader will hear it once, and then again more slowly, The instruction is that the river is everywhere at once, at its source and at its mouth, at the waterfall and the ferry and the mountains and the sea, all in the same instant, and that for the river there is only the present, with no shadow of the past and no shadow of the future upon it. Siddhartha hears this, and it undoes his sense of time. If the water is entire at every point, then the boy he was in his father's house is not gone, and the old man he will become is not waiting somewhere ahead. The whole of a life is present in any moment of it, the way the whole of the river is present in any handful lifted from it. Hesse had reached this by a European road, through Novalis and Eckhart, and the long insomniac nights of his own breakdown. But he set it down in the idiom of the Upanishads his grandfather had kept on the shelves in Calw, and the two traditions met in the sound of moving water, without either of them having to win. That the book earns this ending only by way of a long detour is the second of its teachings, and the harder one for those who come to it looking for a shortcut. Siddhartha does not go from the ascetics to the river. He goes from the ascetics into the town, into Kamala's garden and the merchant Kamaswami's counting house, into silk and wine and dice and the accumulation of money. And he stays there for years, growing heavier and duller and more contemptuous of the people whose appetites he has come to share. Hesse handles this stretch without any tone of warning. The narration neither scolds nor winks. The years of what the book calls the sickness of the soul are not presented as a mistake to be avoided, but as a road that had to be walked, because the young Brahmin who left home was proud, and pride cannot be reasoned away. It can only be spent. He had to become an ordinary man, and to feel the particular exhaustion of an ordinary man who has forgotten what he once knew, before the river could mean anything to him at all. And so the book insists, quietly, on the necessity of the wrong road. It is the argument Hesse had been making since Demian, and would go on making until the end, that the self is not arrived at by keeping clean, that what a man calls his failures are often the only school he was capable of attending. Siddhartha, in the last pages, says as much of himself, that he had to sin in order to live again, that he needed lust, and the pursuit of possessions and the terrible emptiness that followed, in order to learn to stop resisting the world and to love it. That sentence is one of the reasons the book found the readers it did, half a century after its writing, among people who had been told that a life is a straight line and had discovered otherwise. The turn comes at the water's edge, in the worst hour of his life. He has walked out of the town in the night, having left the money and the house and the woman without farewell, and he stands over the river in a state of self-disgust so complete that he leans toward it and wishes to be finished. What stops him is a sound. Out of the depths of his own exhaustion, rising from a part of himself older than everything he has ruined, comes the syllable he was taught as a child in his father's courtyard. Om, the word that means the perfect, the completed, and hearing it, he recognizes his own life again, and lies down on the bank, and sleeps. Hesse renders that sleep as the most healing thing in the whole book. The man does not resolve his despair. He loses consciousness of it, and wakes hours later to birdsong, and the water, and the discovery that a monk is sitting near him, and that the monk is Govinda, his friend from childhood, who does not recognize him. Nothing has been solved. Everything has been set down. Hesse, who had spent 1916 in a sanatorium, and knew what it was to be brought back from a very low place, by nothing more articulate than rest and a river and the presence of another person, wrote that recovery, without a trace of drama. He stays then, and becomes the second ferryman. And for years, the book grows very quiet. 2 men row a boat, split wood, listen to water. And it is here, in the calm, that Hesse sets the deepest wound in the story, because he understood that the hardest listening is not to a river, but to a person who will not be reached. Calw dies at the ferry, bitten by a snake on a pilgrimage, and leaves Siddhartha a son he has never known, a spoilt, grieving, furious boy of 11, who despises the hut and the plain food and the 2 silent old men and everything they represent. Siddhartha loves him with the whole force of a love he has never felt before, and the boy will not have it. He is cold, then cruel, then he steals the money and the boat and runs, and his father goes after him as far as the outskirts of the town, and stands looking at the gate through which he cannot follow. Exactly as, decades earlier, his own father had stood in a doorway, watching him leave. Vasudeva says almost nothing through all of this. He does not tell Siddhartha to let the boy go, does not explain that the son must live his own wrong road as his father lived his, does not offer the consolation that would have been false. He simply waits with him, and when the wound will not close, he takes him down to the water and tells him to listen to it more deeply than he ever has. And in the river, Siddhartha hears all the voices of every life he has known. His father's grief, and his own, his son's departure, and his own departure. The whole endless human chorus of longing and leaving. And hears at last that all of it together, when nothing is separated out and nothing is refused, makes a single sound, and that the sound is the one he first heard as a boy. The pain does not vanish. It is joined to everything else, which is another way of saying that it becomes bearable. Then the teaching completes itself in the only way a teaching of this kind can. Vasudeva rises, looks at his friend with a face full of what the book calls serenity, and says that he has been waiting for this hour, that the ferryman has arrived, and that he will go now into the woods and into oneness. He walks away between the trees, and Hesse does not follow him, does not describe a death, does not permit a farewell scene. The boat and the hut and the crossing pass to Siddhartha, and the book allows this handing on to stand as the whole of what has been transmitted. No formula, no lineage, no book, only a man who learned to listen, taking the place of a man who taught him by listening, at the same stretch of water, with the same silence available to whoever sits down beside it next. It is the resolution of everything Hesse had been unable to say for 18 months in the rooms above Lugano, and it is why the second half came so quickly once it came. What the ferryman knows cannot be told, but it can be occupied. A place at the water, kept faithfully, is itself the doctrine, and the river, indifferent to whether anyone is there, goes on making the sound it has always made, carrying the mountains down to the sea, entire at every point along its length. Siddhartha was published in 1922, and the man who had written it did not become serene. That is the first thing to say about the decade that followed, because readers who come to Hesse in the order of his fame often assume that the river was an arrival, a place he reached and settled in, and that everything afterward was written from the far bank. It was not so. The book had been an act of imagination, performed at the very limit of what he could imagine, and the life that resumed around it was still the life of a man in his middle 40s, who had lost a household, whose health was poor, whose eyes and hands and nerves gave him trouble, and who spent the winters away from Montagnola because the unheated rooms of the Casa Camuzzi were unlivable once the cold came down off the mountains. So, there were the winters in Basel and later in Zurich, in borrowed apartments and rented rooms, in the cities where he had once been an apprentice, and where he now walked as a man nobody recognized in the street. He took the cure at Baden for his sciatica, year after year, and wrote a small, strange book about it, describing the baths and the other patients, and his own irritability, with a self-mockery that is easy to miss under the courtesy. He was drinking wine in the evenings, listening to jazz in the dance halls of the old town, with a kind of appalled fascination, going to costume balls, coming home alone across a bridge at 2 a.m. He was, by his own accounting, a man of the previous century, wandering through a world of gramophones and motorcars, and the comedy of the mismatch did not console him. The second marriage belongs to these years, and lasted hardly any time at all. Ruth Wenger was the daughter of a Basel family, a singer, much younger than he was. The courtship had been long and epistolary, and full of an ardour that neither of them could sustain once it was converted into a household. They married in 1924, and were living apart within months, and the divorce came 3 years later. And he wrote afterward, without excusing himself, that he had been unfit for the ordinary tasks of living with another person. He meant it as a diagnosis rather than a boast. He had escaped one marriage into freedom, and had found that freedom, taken alone, is a room with the door open and nobody in it. He turned 50 in the summer of 1927, and the crisis that produced Steppenwolf had been building for 2 years before that. It was not a collapse of the kind that had put him in a sanatorium a decade earlier. It was quieter and more corrosive. The sense of a man who has been given exactly what he asked for, and finds that it does not fit him, that he is neither the bourgeois whose warmth and lamplight he can still feel through other people's windows, nor the free spirit whose solitude he had claimed as a vocation, but something awkwardly between, at home in neither, despising both, and despising himself for the despising. He wrote a cycle of poems that winter, published privately, in which he called himself a wolf of the steppes, trotting through a world of snow, and the image had come to him with the completeness of things that arrive from underneath. Steppenwolf appeared in 1927, and it is the most violently constructed book he ever made. It comes to the reader in layers, each one distrusting the last. An editor's preface written by a respectable young nephew who found the papers. Then Harry Haller's own record. Then a little treatise on the Steppenwolf that Haller is handed in the street by a man carrying a signboard. Then the descent into the magic theatre, which is announced as being for madmen only. Price of admission your mind. And the argument that the treatise makes is the central one, the one Hesse spent the rest of his life restating. It is that the division Haller has made in himself, the neat and tragic split between the man and the wolf, is a lie of convenience. A human being is not two. A human being is an onion of 100 skins, a chaos of selves, and the attempt to reduce that multitude to a duel between a noble half and a savage half is simply another way of refusing to look. Into that argument, the book releases Hermann, and Pablo with his saxophone, and Maria, and the dance floors, and the whole apparatus of a night world that the bookish suicidal scholar has held in contempt because he has never once tried it. He learns to dance, badly, at 50. He learns the foxtrot. He's taught to take pleasure without demanding that it be redeemed by meaning, and it nearly saves him. And then the magic theatre opens its doors and takes the whole personality apart into its pieces so that they may be reassembled in another order, and Halle fails the final test because he cannot yet laugh. That is the exact location of the book's failure and the book's hope. The immortals, Mozart, Goethe, the ones who look down from the cool blue heaven of art, are characterized not by seriousness, but by laughter. A golden laughter that has passed all the way through suffering and come out the other side into humor. Halle has not got there. He's told he will have to learn to live and to laugh, and the book ends with him promising to play the game better next time. Almost nobody read it that way. This became the great irritation of his later years, and he addressed it directly in a note added to a much later edition, saying that, of all his books, Steppenwolf was the one most often and most violently misunderstood, and that it was read as a book about despair by readers who stopped at the surface and did not notice that it is, above the wolf and above the misery, a book about faith and healing. Young men in particular took it as a permit for their own alienation, a flattering mirror in which to admire their loneliness. He had meant it as an operation, not a portrait. The two halves of the misunderstanding would follow him for 4 decades, and it would happen again, more spectacularly, when the book crossed the ocean in the 1960s and became the property of a generation that heard only the saxophone. He answered it, characteristically, not with polemic, but with another novel, and the other novel is Narcissus and Goldmund, published in 1930. It is the warmest book he ever wrote and the most physically sensuous, and it moves the same argument out of a Swiss city and into a medieval Germany of monasteries and plague roads and chestnut forests. Narcissus is the thinker, ascetic, brilliant, made for the cloister and the discipline of the mind. Goldmund is the wanderer, the lover, the sculptor, who walks out of the monastery gate and spends 20 years in the world learning it through the body, the girls, the roads, the great pestilence, the long apprenticeship to a master woodcarver, the making of a figure that holds everything he has seen, and the crucial move, the one that separates the book from the schematic thing it might have been, is that neither man wins. Narcissus does not convert Goldmund. Goldmund does not shame Narcissus. What passes between them is recognition. The friend who stays discovers what he could not have known without the friend who leaves. And the wanderer comes home at the end to die in the monastery he ran from, having made out of his wandering a single carved face that the ascetic could not have made and could not have imagined. Hesse said something about this that stands as the plainest statement of his method, that all his books, whatever their surface, are a defense of the personality, of the individual, and of the right of the individual to be exactly what he is. He had argued the thinker against the wanderer inside himself since Malbron. He was not going to give either of them a victory. He was going to bring them to a truce and let them sit down together. There is a personal fact in the same years that belongs here, because it is the truce made domestic. Ninon Dolbin, born Ausländer, an art historian from Czernowitz, had first written to him as a girl of 14 after reading Peter Kamenzind. She came to him at the end of the 20s, moved into the cold apartment of the Casa Camusi, and stayed. They married in 1931. In the same year, his friend and patron, Hans Bodmer, had a house built for him on the slope outside Montagnola, the house the neighbours called the Casa Rossa. and gave him the use of it for life. It had heat. It had a garden and a terrace, and a view down through the trees toward the lake. He would live there for the remaining 31 years of his life, and would never again spend a winter in a rented room in a city. Ninon read to him, catalogued him, protected the door, and outlasted every earlier arrangement he had attempted. He wrote of her, late and quietly, as the one who had made the last decades possible. And what those years produced, taken together, is nothing other than the river argument, restated in dry land, Halle's wolf and Halle's man, Narcissus in his cell and Goldmund on his road, the ascetic and the lover, the discipline and the appetite, the winter city and the summer hillside. None of these are problems to be solved, and no book of Hesse's ever solves one. They are voices. The mistake is to insist that one of them be silenced so that the other may be true. The river had taught, over the 18 months he could not write, that everything sounds at once, and that the sound is only bearable when nothing is left out. He was now saying the same thing about a man's own contradictions, which are not a disease to be cured but a music to be heard, and the hearing of them, patiently, without hurrying to a verdict, is the whole of the work. By 1931, when the house on the slope was finished, and the door had someone behind it to guard it, he had already begun the book that would take him 11 years. He worked on it through the decade in which Germany closed itself, through the burning of books and the tightening of what could be printed and by whom, through the years in which his own titles were quietly discouraged in the country of his birth, and his letters to friends inside it had to be phrased with care. He was by then a Swiss citizen, had been since the war, and the distance was not merely legal. What he was writing was set some 400 years in the future, in a province of the mind, and it was in part a way of surviving a present he could not consent to. The glass bead game was published at last in Zurich in 1943, in 2 volumes by a Swiss house, because no German publisher was permitted to bring it out. It went into a country at peace and could not cross into the country at war, and its author, who had spent his youth being told he must choose a doctrine, watched from a hillside above Lugano while the doctrines burned each other down. The province is called Castalia, and it is beautiful, and that is the difficulty of the book. Hesse built there the most perfected life of the mind he could imagine. An order of scholars and musicians, celibate, unhurried, supported by the state, and released from the vulgarity of ambition, who devote themselves to a game that gathers all the disciplines into one language. The glass bead game itself is never fully described, and the refusal to describe it is deliberate. It is a way of setting a theme from mathematics beside a passage of Bach and a Chinese ideogram and a law of astronomy, and holding them in a single figure so that their correspondences sound together. It is, in other words, a listening, an ordered attention to the harmonies that run beneath separate fields. That the highest achievement Hesse could invent for a civilization is the hearing of relations rather than the assertion of a truth tells the whole of what he had come to by 60. Joseph Knecht rises through this order as its most gifted child. He is chosen, trained, sent as an envoy to a Benedictine monastery, where the old historian, Pater Jacobus, teaches him that the province he loves has forgotten it exists inside history, and is therefore in danger of it. He becomes Magister Ludi, master of the game, the summit of the whole hierarchy, and administers it with such quiet excellence that his colleagues believe him wholly theirs. And then he resigns. He writes a long letter to the board explaining what he has seen, and when the letter is met with the polite incomprehension of men who cannot imagine leaving, he simply walks out of Castalia to become the private tutor of a single boy, the difficult son of a friend, a young man named Tito, who has no interest in being taught. Within days of arriving in the mountains, he goes into a cold lake in the early morning after the boy, whose challenge he will not refuse. And there in the water, the life ends. It is the strangest ending in Hesse's work, and the one he was least willing to explain. A reader may take it as failure, as the waste of a great man on a small errand. But the shape is the shape of everything he had written since the ferry crossing. The perfected discipline is not the destination. Knecht leaves the province exactly as Siddhartha left the ascetics, and as Hesse himself had left the seminary at Maulbronn 50 years before. And he leaves it not for a better doctrine, but for one ordinary pupil who does not yet know how to listen. The teaching passes downward into a life that will not honor it, and the teacher is gone by morning, and the boy is left standing at the edge of the water with something he will spend years learning to carry. Vasudeva had walked into the woods. Knecht goes into the lake. In both cases, the transmission is completed, not by argument, but by disappearance. And what remains behind is the sound of the water, and a young man alone with it, while the book was being written. Another occupation had quietly overtaken his days, and it was, in its way, the same work in a smaller key. From the middle of the 1930s onward, the letters came. They came from refugees who had lost their countries, from young soldiers in field hospitals, from students who had read Demian in secret, from prisoners, from parents of the dead, from ordinary people who had no reason to believe a novelist in Ticino would answer, and who wrote anyway, because they had nowhere else to put the sentence they were carrying. He answered them. He answered thousands of them. The estimate runs past 30,000 letters over the last 3 decades of his life. Many dictated to Ninon, many written out by hand in the mornings before the day's other work. Some of them long and careful, some only a paragraph and a poem enclosed. He complained about it constantly and never stopped doing it. It cost him whole years of writing he might otherwise have done, and he seems to have decided, somewhere in the middle of it, that this was not a subtraction from the work, but the last form of it. A stranger's difficulty, read slowly and answered without haste. That was the ferry, run daily, from a desk above a lake. In 1946, the Nobel Prize in Literature came to him, cited for writings which, while growing in boldness and penetration, exemplify the classical humanitarian ideals and high qualities of style. He was 69 and unwell, and he did not go to Stockholm. A Swiss envoy accepted it on his behalf and read out the short address he had sent, in which he spoke of the ideal of a supranational world of the spirit and of his gratitude that a small country's language had been heard. The prize arrived at the exact moment when Germany, ruined and hungry, was beginning to reprint him, and a generation who had grown up under a regime that despised inwardness found in his books a door they could open in private. Money from the prize went out again in parcels and gifts through the same channels the letters used. Then he withdrew. The last 16 years were deliberately quiet. He refused most invitations, gave almost no lectures, declined the ceremonial roles that were pressed on him, and let the world come to him in envelopes rather than in person. The days grew small and were not the poorer for it. There was the garden, the burning of leaves in autumn, which he wrote about with more attention than he gave to most public events. The pruning, the walk down through the chestnut woods, the watercolours he still made of the same hillside in the same light and never tired of. His eyes troubled him, and his hands ached with arthritis, and he worked around both. He wrote short prose, reminiscences, and poems, and he read the letters, and Ninon protected the hours. Visitors who came expecting a sage found instead an old man in a straw hat who wanted to talk about the weather and the state of the vines, and who deflected reverence with the practiced ease of someone who had long ago decided that being made into a teacher was the one thing that would ruin him. In the summer of 1962, he was 85. He had been ill and had recovered enough to work. In early August, he finished a poem more about the creaking of a broken branch on the hillside near the house. A branch half torn away and hanging on, dry and stubborn, making its small dry sound in the wind. And he revised the last lines of it on the evening of the 8th. That night, he went to sleep and did not wake. A hemorrhage in the brain took him quietly before morning on the 9th of August. Ninon found him. They buried him at Santa Bondio, in the little churchyard at Gentilino above the lake, a short walk from where Hugo Ball lay. The friend who had written the first book about him, almost 40 years earlier. The grave is plain. People still leave stones on it, and sometimes flowers, and sometimes a page. And now the boy at the Nagold can be seen properly at last. Spring of 1891, 13 years old. Out of the pietist house without permission, standing at the weir below the tannery in Calw, and watching the brown water fold over the stones and go on. He did not know then what he was doing. He would spend the next 70 years finding out. He would run from a seminary and be handled by doctors and sell books in Tübingen and become famous for a novel he had not yet earned, and go east to find that east was a direction and not a place, and beg Europe not to make the war into a faith and be called a traitor for it, and lose his father and his marriage and his footing all in 1 year, and sit 72 times in a room in Lucerne, while a man asked him patiently what he dreamed. He would be blocked for 18 months in 4 rooms above Lugano, because he could not yet write a wisdom he did not possess. And then a ferryman would say the thing he had been waiting his whole life to hear, which was only that the water is worth listening to. He would take his own contradictions apart in public and refuse to have them resolved. He would build a province of the mind and then walk out of it for one pupil. All of it was already there, in the sound at the weir. The river is everywhere at once, at the spring and at the mouth, and in the rain that has not yet fallen. And it is never the same water, and always the same river. It does not hurry, and it does not wait, and it does not require anything of the one standing at the bank, except that they stop talking long enough to hear it. It went past the boy that spring afternoon, and it went past the old man on his hillside, and it is going past still, patient, unhurried, saying the one thing it has always said, which is nothing at all and everything. A long, low, unbroken sound moving away downstream into the dark, carrying whoever listens gently along with it, down